Hey everybody. In October 2018, I published the video, Don't Socially Isolate Yourself, and in it, I talked about the dangers of social isolation. While this video will be a deeper dive into this subject, I'm also going to touch on loneliness as a consequence of social isolation. And then I'm going to talk about what men can do to avoid social isolation and loneliness. I'm also going to touch on the importance of having face-to-face, in-person interactions rather than online interactions alone, and why these face-to-face interactions are so important. One of the main reasons I'm making this video is because I believe an honest and candid discussion on this important topic is way overdue. While some content creators have touched on these issues, in my view, this is a subject that deserves far more attention than the Redpill manosphere currently gives it. Another motivation for this video is TFM's September 2015 video, Male Vulnerability Need. This video builds on TFM's statements in that video that men should connect with one another and form close friendships. With that out of the way, let's dive in. According to Wikipedia, social isolation is a state of complete or near complete lack of contact between an individual and society. It differs from loneliness, which reflects temporary and involuntary lack of contact with other humans in the world. Social isolation can be an issue for individuals of any age, though symptoms may differ by age group. Social isolation has similar characteristics in both temporary instances and for those with a historical lifelong isolation cycle. All types of social isolation can include staying home for lengthy periods of time, having no communication with family, acquaintances, or friends, and or willfully avoiding any contact with other humans when those opportunities do arise. The following risk factors contribute to reasons why individuals distance themselves from society. Family crisis mostly occurs when one member of a family neglectfully performs harmful action. For example, if a parent performs any unwillful action against a child, the child could end up in shock and eventually feel defeatist. Furthermore, the symptoms could last for the child for an indefinite period of time, with more symptoms uprising. So, this is kind of a tactful way of saying child abuse or child neglect. So, if a child suffers neglect or abuse at the hands of another family member, this can contribute to social isolation. Health and disabilities. People may be embarrassed by their disabilities or health problems, such that they have a tendency to isolate themselves to avoid social interaction out of fear that they would be judged or stigmatized. This is common in people who have autism and other known disorders. Loss of a spouse. If a spouse is recently separated, divorced, or died, the other person may feel lonely and depressed. And by the way, this sort of thing is extremely common amongst men who are abandoned by their wives. Living alone. A 2015 study by the National Center for Family and Marriage Research found that 13% of adults in the United States were living alone. That is up from 12% in 1990. The rate of living alone for people under 45 has not changed, but the rate for Americans aged 45 to 65 has increased over the past 25 years. People over the age of 65 are living alone less often. Unemployment. This shows a sign if anyone was recently fired, dismissed, or released from a job or workplace. If the person is unable to seek any future employment, the symptoms could be imminent. Transportation problems. If the person doesn't have transportation to attend gatherings or simply just can't get out of the house, they have no choice but to stay home all day, which can lead to those feelings of depression. Societal adversity. Desire to avoid the discomfort, dangers, and responsibilities arising from being among people. This can happen if other people are sometimes or often rude, hostile, critical, or judgmental, crude, or otherwise unpleasant. The person would just prefer to be alone to avoid the hassles and hardships of dealing with people. There are some cases, while not even seeing the sun long enough each day will affect them. By the time they try to go out and play, heart attacks and heat strokes are more common. Social isolation can begin early in life. During this time of development, a person may become more preoccupied with feelings and thoughts of their individuality that are not easy to share with other individuals. This can result from feelings of shame, guilt, or alienation during childhood experiences. Social isolation can also coincide with developmental disabilities. Individuals with learning impairments may have trouble with social interaction. The difficulties experienced academically can greatly impact the individual's esteem and sense of self-worth. An example would be the need to repeat a year of school. During the early childhood developmental years, the need to fit in and be accepted is paramount. Having a learning deficit can in turn lead to feelings of isolation, that they are somehow different from the others. Substance abuse can also be an element in isolation, whether a cause or a result. This can and many times does coincide with mood-related disorders, but also with loneliness. According to a study that was conducted by 4 people with names that I'm not even going to try to pronounce, living alone can also increase rates of being socially isolated and leading individuals to turn to the use of alcohol and other substances. And on the subject of loneliness, Wikipedia defines loneliness as follows. Loneliness is a complex and usually unpleasant emotional response to isolation. Loneliness typically includes anxious feelings about a lack of connection or communication with other beings, both in the present and extending into the future. As such, loneliness can be felt even when surrounded by other people. The causes of loneliness are varied and include social, mental, emotional, and physical factors. Loneliness has been linked with depression and is thus a risk factor for suicide. Emil Durkheim has described loneliness, specifically the inability or unwillingness to live for others, i.e., for friendships or altruistic ideas, as the main reason for what he called egotistic suicide. In adults, loneliness is a major precipitant of depression and alcoholism. People who are socially isolated may report poor sleep quality and thus have diminished restorative processes. Loneliness has also been linked with a schizoid character type, in which one may see the world differently and experience social alienation, described as the self in exile. In children, a lack of social connections is directly linked to several forms of antisocial and self-destructive behavior, most notably hostile and delinquent behavior. In both children and adults, loneliness often has a negative impact on learning and memory. Its disruption of sleep patterns can have a significant impact on the ability to function in everyday life. Pain, depression, and fatigue function as a symptom cluster and thus may share common risk factors. 2 longitudinal studies with different populations demonstrated that loneliness was a risk factor for the development of the pain, depression, and fatigue symptom cluster over time. This data also highlights the health risks of loneliness, pain, and depression and fatigue that often accompany serious illness and place people at risk for poor health and mortality. Chronic loneliness can be a serious, life-threatening health condition. It has been found to be associated with an increased risk of stroke and cardiovascular disease. Loneliness shows an increased incidence of high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and obesity. Loneliness is shown to increase the concentration of cortisol levels in the body. Prolonged high cortisol levels can cause anxiety, depression, digestive problems, heart disease, sleep problems, and weight gain. Loneliness has been associated with impaired cellular immunity as reflected in lower natural killer cell activity and higher antibody titers to the Epstein-Barr virus and human herpes viruses. Because of impaired cellular immunity, loneliness among young adults shows vaccines like the flu vaccine to be less effective. Data from studies on loneliness and HIV-positive men suggests loneliness increases disease progression. According to Connecticut Mental Health, it's no secret that isolation can lead to a decline in physical health. Studies show that a lack of social connections can increase the risk of death by at least 50%, while in some cases, isolation can increase the risk of mortality by more than 90%. Furthermore, social isolation has been linked to higher blood pressure and cardiovascular disease, vulnerability to infection, and an overactive immune response. Loneliness can affect your mental and emotional health as well as your physical well-being. Without enough social interaction, you may be at risk of cognitive decline, depression, neuroticism, and hallucinations. Social isolation can also get in the way of everyday functioning. It can throw off sleep patterns, disrupt focus, and affect logical and verbal reasoning. So now that we've discussed the problem of social isolation, loneliness, and the myriad of mental health and physical problems associated with it, let's talk about some solutions. According to the Verywell Mind, psychologists and other mental health professionals often talk about the importance of having a strong social support network. When trying to reach our goals or to deal with a crisis, experts frequently implore people to lean on their friends and family for support. Research has also demonstrated the link between social relationships and many different aspects of health and wellness. Social support refers to the psychological and material resources provided by a social network to help individuals cope with stress. Such social support may come in different forms. Sometimes it might involve helping a person with various daily tasks when they are ill, or offering financial assistance when they are in need. In other situations, it could involve giving advice to a friend when they are facing a difficult situation. And sometimes, it simply involves providing caring, empathy, and concern for loved ones in need. And then we move on to mentalhealthamerica.net. And this site has some practical advice on how to get and stay socially connected. They state, research has shown that social support wards off the effects of stress on depression, anxiety, and other health problems. Do you need to be more connected to others? Here are some tips to help you create a plan to make, keep, and strengthen connections in your life. Make a short list of friends and family members who are supportive and positive. Also include a list of people you feel the need to stay in touch with regularly, such as parents, a close friend, or adult child who lives far away, or an aging relative who lives alone. Make a commitment to yourself to call, email, or get together with them on a schedule that's reasonable for you. Try to reach out and make at least one emotional connection a day, but plan realistically. In case of long distance, consider using web-based ways of keeping in touch, like Skype or Facebook. Share what's on your mind, honestly and openly. Talk about your concerns in a straightforward way, but try to keep it constructive. Try to be direct about what you need. For example, a sympathetic ear, help solving a problem, a fresh perspective, new ideas, or just a good laugh. Don't hesitate to ask for the kind of help you'd like. Ask what other people think about your situation and show them you value their opinion. When you talk, also listen. Ask about someone else's day, or follow up on the topic of a previous conversation. Showing sincere interest in another person's life builds relationships, and listening to other people's concerns can often shed a new light on your own challenges. Offer help or advice if asked. Listen and respond. Make social plans. Create opportunities to strengthen your relationships with fun things that both you and your friend or relative will enjoy. Looking forward to special activities boosts our spirits, gives us energy, and makes us more productive. So, while it's important to build and maintain a strong social network to prevent social isolation and loneliness, I believe that this needs to be done through face-to-face, in-person interaction. And why is this? It's because much of communication is nonverbal. According to nonverbalgroup.com, one of the most frequently quoted statistics on nonverbal communication is that 93% of all daily communication is nonverbal. Popular science magazines, students, and media outlets frequently quote this specific number. So, where does this number come from? Dr. Albert Mehrabian, author of Silent Messages, conducted several studies on nonverbal communication. He found that 7% of any message is conveyed through words, 38% through certain vocal elements, and 55% through nonverbal elements, facial expressions, gestures, posture, etc. Subtracting the 7% for actual vocal content leaves one with the 93% statistic. The fact of the matter is that the exact number is irrelevant. Knowing that communication is specifically 75% nonverbal or 90% nonverbal holds no practical applications. The important part is that most communication is nonverbal. In fact, nonverbal behavior is the most crucial aspect of communication. And I agree with that completely, which is why you have to have in-person, face-to-face interactions with people who are close to you. And fastcompany.com agrees with my assessment. They state, often when people meet face-to-face, they touch each other. This can be ritualized, a handshake, or just in the course of holding doors, or a business-appropriate touch on the arm at the end of a meeting. Regardless, touch is a powerful sense. An experiment done by researchers at the University of Chicago and Harvard found that negotiators who shook hands were more open and honest and reached better outcomes. Shaking hands causes the centers of the brain associated with rewards to activate. You are literally conveying warmth. Albert Mehrabian, a major figure in the study of nonverbal communication, introduced an equation about contradictory feedback in his 1971 book, Silent Messages. Total feeling equals 7% verbal feeling plus 38% vocal feeling plus 55% facial feeling. In other words, the degree of light conveyed by the facial expression will dominate and determine the impact of the total message. It's harder to hide reality in person. People's pupils dilate when they are happy or excited and constrict when they are sad. As you look into someone's eyes, you absorb this emotional information and respond. This means face-to-face meetings are best when you feel someone is being too guarded, or you'd like to know the truth. Example, a client isn't really happy with your team, but doesn't want to engage with the conversation. It's harder to hide reality in person. You also pay more attention. There are social consequences to looking at your phone when someone is talking with you if she can see you do it. But also, as all your senses are engaged in noticing things about the other person, including aspects that wouldn't be picked up by a video conference that forces your brain to work harder and to be more engaged. So by now, it should be very apparent that men and boys of all ages who socially isolate often become lonely, which leads to a variety of physical and mental health problems in both the short term and the long term. This includes, but is not limited to, depression, neuroticism, decreased cognitive function. And men who are socially isolated have a decreased ability to cope with disagreement and often don't possess healthy conflict resolution tools. To be clear, social isolation and loneliness lead to major mental health deterioration and eventually an early death. However, men who are socially isolated and lonely can break the cycle by reforging healthy relationships with their family, friends, and the people in their local communities. It's important to reiterate that healthy in-person, face-to-face contact with friends, family, and other social connections are necessary because, among other reasons, most communication between humans is through body language, and only 7% of communication is through words alone. In-person interactions are imperative to increase the social bonds of support required to avoid and recover from the mental health and physical deterioration caused by social isolation and loneliness. And here's one final thing I want you to think about. Anyone who promotes social isolation over healthy in-person social support is either trying to sell you something or they're attempting to isolate you and make you vulnerable for some other ulterior motive. One of the first things that many predators, both online and offline, do first is socially isolate their targeted victims while virtue signaling that they just want to try to help them, which, in my experience, is never the case. With that said, I'd like to know what your thoughts are about what I've discussed in this video. Let me know in the comments below. I'm DDJ, And this red pill reality check about the dangers of social isolation is your dose of misandry today.